The conversations that happen at home can change the conversations that happen outside and down the street or across borders and around the world. But in God's house, where does the conversation start? It starts with a dream placed by God, a dream meant to inspire us, to lead the world to Him, to do what only He can do.
Oh, that's dramatic. How's it going? All right. Y'all doing all right? All right. I'm going to scribble on the board here in a little bit, so none of you will be able to read it, but it's fine. Keeps my hands busy. That was a bad handwriting joke. Welcome to New Life. How you feeling? Okay, so we've been doing this thing where we talk about kind of biblical principles involving money before we get rolling and we take the offering, because I want to spend time and actually unpack that, right? I don't think a lot of times we do that. So this is going to be a real quick 2-minute lesson. You ready? Nope, you're not ready. I'm not feeling it. All right, so first, there's this parable in Matthew chapter 25, and it's called the parable of the bags of gold. And the basic principle is this: there's a master, and the master has 3 servants, and he gives each one of these servants an amount of money to take care of while he's gone, and he gives them the amount according to their ability, because he's a good master, right? He's not going to give too much to the guy who can't handle a lot. You get what I'm saying? And so the one guy gets 5 bags of gold, the other one gets 2, and the other one gets 1. And when he comes back, he expects to see the return, right, on that investment. And he comes back, the guy with 5 has 10, the guy with 2 has 4, and then the guy with 1 got scared and buried it and gave him back just a dirty bag, which anybody, inflation, with inflation, it was worth I don't know, what is it this year, 8% less than it was the year before? That's kind of that's the story. And Jesus says when the master returned, he rewarded the 2 who had done well, and the other one he cast out. Now, here's the principle I'm getting at. It's stewardship. When it comes to the tithes and offerings, when it comes to money in our lives, right? Stewardship is the principle. That's the goal. We want to be good stewards of what God's given us. Now, the tithe and the offering, that's part of stewardship, but also, in this story, God, the godly thing for these servants to do is to invest the money and make more of it. And so when it comes to our money, one of the things that I don't think is talked about enough in the church is how we handle it matters. How we handle it matters, not just what you give it to, but also how you handle it, how you make it grow, that matters. And if you handle it well, God will He'll bless you with more. And if you don't handle it well, He's not gonna give you more because you can't handle it. The story actually ends with that promise. He who has will have even more and have it in abundance. And he who does not will have nothing, will have less. Why? Because God's not going to give you more if you can't handle it. Does this make sense? And so I say all of that to say, I know we've been talking about this for a couple minutes before every sermon, and I know that it might make some of you feel awkward, but listen, the Bible also says, save it, invest it, be smart with it all the way around. Does that work? All right, let me pray, and the ushers can come on down. God, we love you. We thank you for the opportunity to be generous. But God, we also just pray in this time that you would help us be good and wise stewards with the resources you've given us. Not just money, but also with our time and with the gifts and the talents you've given us. Let us be a people who is faithful in stewarding what you've given us. We love you and we thank you. Amen. All right. So, the series is called Big God, Big Dreams, right? And the idea is really this. I believe that God has given all of us something that is of him, that he wants us to do, and that will ultimately bring purpose, great purpose and contentment to our lives, right? I believe that God's given all of us something. And maybe he's given some of us some things, right? Maybe it's not a thing, maybe it's multiple things. And so oftentimes in the Bible, when that purpose is given to someone, it's a dream. And then we call it dreams. We want to dream big, all of this stuff, right? And so that's the idea, is that we're going to unpack what that looks like. So last week, the conversation was like, how do I discern whether this is God or this is, like I got gas, Like, how do I discern whether it's one or the other? I don't know, and sometimes that can be hard. This week, the conversation is we're going to have more of a conversation about the process. How does this God dream work in my life? How does God's plans for my life interact with me? And what does that process generally look like? And so we're going to be unpacking the story of Joseph. So I'm going to kind of catch you up on the chronology, the history here between Abraham, who we spoke about last week, and Joseph, just because this story is important to me and it's important in the scripture. So we started with Abraham. Abraham is the father of the nation of Israel. He's promised when he's 75 years old that he's going to have a kid, and that kid will be will produce nations, right? And then the promise doesn't get fulfilled till he's 100 years old, and he has a son named Isaac. And Isaac is Abraham's only. It's the son that was promised. Abraham has another son named Ishmael by his wife's servant. But Isaac is kind of the focus, right? So Isaac becomes the father of Esau and Jacob. And so he only has two kids, Esau and Jacob. They're twins, and Esau is the firstborn, and Jacob, as the story goes, comes out grasping at his heel. That's the idea. I don't think it's all that likely that it came out like this, but maybe, Superman pose. Okay, so anyway, came out grasping at his heel. That's what his name means, heel grabber, and that's a Hebrew idiom for deceiver, which is pretty much the story of Jacob's life. He lies, cheats, and steals to get everything he wants. So he cheats his brother Esau out of his birthright, meaning his place as the firstborn. So this would be, I don't know how he could, I don't really know how it would work that all of a sudden now he gets the rights given to the firstborn, but that's basically Esau trades him his rights as the firstborn for a bowl of lentil soup. Not worth it. Lentils are gross. Anyway, I don't like lentils, but he trades his birthright for a bowl of lentil soup because he's hungry, right? And then later on, he cheats Esau out of his father's blessing. So basically what this means is he's cheated Esau out of his place in the family as the firstborn. That's an important thing in these days because the firstborn gets lots of different rights bestowed on them, but then also he gets Esau's inheritance, because he cheats Esau out of that by lying to his father and receiving the blessing. So he gets everything, and he cheats his brother out of everything. So his brother is mad at him. He ends up running away. He gets married. He has two wives that they're sisters, and it's this whole thing. Story's crazy. Anyway, he ends up, after all of that, he has like 13 sons by the end of his life. We're going to pick up in the place where we're talking about Joseph, who's his 12th son, I believe. And we're going to go from there. So that starts in Genesis chapter 37. And I'm going to just tell you this story because we're going to be dragging from Genesis 37 all the way to like 45. And if I were to stand here and read this to you right now, you'd get up and leave. And we'd be here till 3 o'clock. So I'm just going to tell you the story. Does that work? Yeah. So, The Joseph is 17 years old, and at this point where the story picks up, he's 17, and he's his father's favorite kid. Joseph was born later in Jacob's life, and he was born by Jacob's favorite wife. That's awkward. To have two wives is extremely awkward. To have favorites has got to be worse. And so he's born by Jacob's favorite wife, and so that's his favorite kid. And so Joseph, 17 years old, his dad gets him a cool coat. It's a coat of many colors, and his brothers don't have one. So essentially, Joseph goes to school in a North Face, and his brothers go to school in Walmart jackets. Like, you get the idea? And so that's kind of the way this is going. Then Joseph wakes up one morning, he's like, hey, I had a dream. And he tells his brothers, I had a dream. And they're like, okay, weirdo, tell us about it, I guess. And he said, one day, y'all are gonna bow down to me. Now, this is a problem. They are not happy about this at all because they're like, you arrogant little turd. How? No, we're not gonna bow down to you. You have to unpack that in this day and age, first of all, there's like a hierarchy in the family and the oldest to the youngest. If the youngest says one day you're gonna bow down to me, like that's a problem. It's disrespectful, right? And how are you gonna be better than me? My birthright says I'm better than you. I was born this way, right? And so there's that. But then there's also this added conflict because they have to have known Jacob's past and how Jacob was not the oldest, but he leapfrogged his brother and got all his brother's birthrights. And like also Joseph is his favorite. So maybe Jacob isn't gonna follow the tradition and he is just gonna give Joseph everything and they are gonna have to work for him on the family farm, you know? And so they're like really upset about this because he's being a jerk and like, what the heck? And so one day, Joseph leaves the house and he goes to meet his brothers because they're tending the sheep. And they see him coming from a distance and they're like, hey, we should kill him because I don't know. They decide they should kill him. One of the brothers says, hey, wait a minute, don't kill him. Just throw him in a hole over here. And his plan is to go back around, collect him after they've gone back to their father and give him back to the dad and say, all of these jokers lied to you. That's his plan. He's gonna double cross his brothers. So they don't kill him, they throw him in a hole, and then they take his pretty jacket, they cover it in goat's blood, they take it to their dad and they say, hey, Joseph was killed by a wild animal. And Jacob begins mourning, right? So the one brother's gonna go back and try to free him, but the other brothers get to him first and they sell him into slavery. They sell him to this guy named Potiphar. Potiphar is the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. So he's a powerful man in the most powerful kingdom of the time. And Joseph ends up working in Potiphar's house. He then becomes like the head guy in Potiphar's house. He's like the lead servant. He's basically master of the house. He's the head butler. He's the guy who's in charge other than Potiphar. And what happens is one day, Potiphar's wife notices Joseph and says, oh, you look nice. Let's go. Will you sleep with me? And he says, no, I won't. Like your husband he's not kept anything in this house from me. I'm in charge of everything. The only thing he's kept from me is you because you're his wife, so no, right? And a few days later or whatever, Joseph is doing his chores and there's all the servants are outside, he's working in the house, and Potiphar's wife comes up to him, tries to seduce him again. He says no and runs out of the house but leaves his cloak. So then she's left there holding his jacket and she tells Potiphar when he gets home, look, that servant of yours tried to rape me. Here's his jacket. He left it when he ran off, right? And so now Joseph is in trouble. So he gets sold into slavery. He becomes the leader of the house by, I guess, doing a good job. Then he gets in trouble here and he ends up in jail. So he's in the dungeon, it says, with Pharaoh's. He's in Pharaoh's dungeon. He's in jail, and even in jail, he rises up to be like the head prisoner. Like he's like a leader amongst the prisoners. He's doing a good job there. And one day, Pharaoh's cupbearer and his baker get sent into jail. So you might go like, why does it matter that they're Pharaoh's cupbearer and his baker? There's a few things here. It matters because those two people would have been in very close proximity to the king, to Pharaoh, right? Like, because the cupbearer's job is to eat and drink everything before Pharaoh. So in case he's getting poisoned, he knows the cupbearer dies first. So he drinks the wine first, then gives it to Pharaoh. And then he takes a bite of the food first, gives it to Pharaoh. That's the whole idea. This is the safeguard against getting poisoned. And then the baker would have been a very important person in terms of this whole deal, because he would be someone who would have the ability to poison Pharaoh, right? They're all in close proximity to the guy. And so, I don't know why they end up in jail. Either they made stale bread or something and it got past the cupbearer, so now he's mad at both of them, or maybe Pharaoh got food poisoning and so he's mad at both of them, whatever. So they end up in jail, and one night, both of them have a dream. Same night, they both have a dream. And they're like, man, we had this crazy dream. They said that to Joseph, and Joseph was like, well, tell me about it. And they're like, you interpret dreams? He's like, well, no, but God will tell me what it means. So, yeah. And so they tell him, and basically it goes like this. The cupbearer's dream, Joseph tells him, the cupbearer's dream means that he's going to be restored to his former place and that everything's going to be okay. The baker's dream, the interpretation basically goes like this. Your dream means that your head's going to get cut off, you're going to get impaled, and the birds are going to eat you. Yeah, it's the Bible, right? So it gets kind of wild. Ancient times were crazy and gross. And so that's the two dreams. And oh, by the way, that's going to happen in 3 days. So 3 days later, the Pharaoh's having a party. He calls up his two servants out of the dungeon. He gives the cupbearer his old job back, and then he turns the baker into a piñata, and that's it. That's kind of how this ends up, and nothing changes for Joseph. He told the cupbearer, hey, when you get back to Pharaoh, remember me and tell him what I've done for you, and also let him know I haven't done anything to be here. I'm an innocent man, right? And the cupbearer's like, yeah, I'll remember you. 2 years go by, and the cupbearer's just forgotten him. Hasn't brought it up to the Pharaoh, nothing. Just forgot him. He's just chilling in the dungeon, I guess, right? Then one morning, Pharaoh wakes up and goes, man, I have had 2 crazy dreams. And the cupbearer goes, I know a guy. He's the Hebrew guy. He used to work for the captain of the guard. He's in the dungeon. Why don't you go get him and he can interpret the dream? So they bring Joseph up to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh goes, so here's the first dream. There's these 7 cows, and they look real good. They're fat. They're looking great. And they go down and they're eating and drinking from the river. And then these 7 other cows come up, and they look real skinny and gross and nasty, and they eat the good-looking cows. And then I woke up. Then I fell back asleep, and here's the other dream. There's 7 heads of grain. They look healthy and wonderful and awesome. And then all of a sudden, there's these 7 other heads of grain, and they look terrible and gross, and they eat the other heads of grain. Wasn't me. And Joseph says, look, there's going to be a period of famine, and there's going to be a period of plenty. During the period of plenty, you have to save enough food and supplies and everything else to outlast the period of famine. That's what the dream means. And then Pharaoh goes, cool, that's your job now, figure it out. Okay. So Joseph ends up in charge over just about everything in the kingdom, and he's working them through this time of plenty and the time of famine, and he's making sure that it all works out. During this same time, back at home, his family is starting to starve because of the famine. The famine reaches to where they're living, and they're starting to starve. So they tell, the father tells the sons, go to Egypt. I hear they have food. See if they'll give you any. So they go to Egypt, and they end up in front of Joseph, but they don't recognize him. And then there's this whole period of stuff where Joseph messes with them. He's like, you leave your one brother here, Benjamin, because Benjamin's like the little one, and I don't think he met Benjamin yet. So he's like, leave him here, I'm gonna hang out with him. You go back to your father, and just messes with him. They're afraid he's gonna kill Benjamin. Like brothers do, Joseph, I think, is just getting his pound of flesh. You know how it goes. If you get into, anybody have brothers? If you get into a fight with your brother, you flick him, he's gonna hit you with a baseball bat kind of thing. It's kind of like that. So they're just doing their thing. Eventually, he tells them who he is, And they bring Jacob into the country, and the family settles there, and they survive the famine. And that's, the story essentially goes from there to they thrive in Egypt. They become a large nation. Pharaoh looks around and goes, there's way too many of these Hebrews around here. We need to enslave them and keep them under control. So they do that, and then you end up kind of making your way to Moses. That's kind of the arc of the story. Moses we're going to cover next week. So what we're going to unpack out of this story of Joseph today is like the process, how it unfolds, how God's plan unfolds for someone whom he's given a dream. And this is like, I'm not saying that this is like patented, this is exactly how it's going to work for you, right? That would be silly. But there's this general arc that the Bible takes with these stories that it tends to unfold the same way in a lot of them. And I think that it's helpful for us to see, because I think it's helpful for how our lives go. So let me draw this. So essentially, the story arc for Joseph goes like this. Right here, right? He has his dream. And if you haven't, this is a chart, right? So it starts at like a middle ground place. He has this dream. He's given this dream, and it's like the beginning of something, and it's a pretty high point, right? But then what happens right after that is everything tanks. He has a dream, and then all of a sudden, he gets sold into slavery, right? So God's told him that this is how it's gonna go, but then all of a sudden, things get real weird. And then after that, he spends this long period of time basically doing nothing, like nothing impactful, nothing towards that dream you would think. He's a slave, then he's a prisoner, and then he's still kind of a slave, but he's like so anyway, he spends this time down here, and then all of a sudden, he ends up in Pharaoh's court. He ends up being number 2 in the whole nation, and he does become what his dream said he would become, because his brothers come to him and bow before him, right? Now, it doesn't look anything like, I'm getting ahead of myself. So you have the dream, and then you have this little tanking situation, and then you have this long period of obscurity, right? And that's kind of the arc of how the way that this story goes. But it's not just the way that this story goes. This is the way that lots of biblical hero stories go. So Joseph, like I said, dream, obscurity, fulfillment. Moses figures out somewhere like early in his life that he's supposed to defend the Hebrews. He's supposed to help the Hebrews get out of slavery. What ends up happening is he unpacks it completely the wrong way, kills a guard, ends up on the run, spends 40 years in, not wandering, but in the wilderness away from his people. Then he gets called to lead them out of captivity, and then he becomes the leader. Jesus teaches in the temple, spends about 20 years after that as a carpenter, 3-year ministry. King David gets anointed as a kid, spends the pretty much the rest of this time running from King Saul, because he was anointed by God to have Saul's position, and Saul's mad at him. And so he's running from Saul, then he becomes king. This story arc is kind of the way it works, right? And there's definitely, there's differences, there's little bits and pieces here, but this is the general thing. And so, why? The first thing that we can unpack from the story is this. When God gives you a dream, it's probably not going to happen immediately, right? It's probably not going to happen immediately. It can, but usually it doesn't. It usually follows this process, right? So for Joseph, it did not happen immediately. He has a dream at 17, and it takes him years and years and years, right? The next thing is it will not happen how you envision it at all. Most likely, Joseph believed that he was going to receive his father's blessing, and he was going to take over the family farm, and he was going to tell his brothers what to do. That's probably what he thought. He basically was probably like, hey, I'm dad's favorite. Y'all know I'm dad's favorite. He's gonna give me the farm one day and y'all are gonna have to listen to me. Isn't that funny? And that's not at all what God had called for him to do. That's not at all the way that God saw this playing out. God saw bigger things. I think a lot of times for us, when we're unpacking the things that God's called us to, the dreams that God's put on our hearts, we watch it, and as it unfolds, we expect for it to unfold in the logical pattern that we want it to unfold because we're smart and it should follow the logical pattern. And like God's plan never follows the logical pattern you want it to. It's like we take a hard left over here, then we take a hard right over here, and it's like all over the place. And then you turn around and you realize like, oh my gosh, this is way bigger and way different than I thought it was. And so I say that to say, like, as we're unpacking the dreams that God's placed on our heart and we're unpacking where this is all gonna go and how we see this playing out, you have to remember, like, it's not gonna be what you expect it to be all the time. It's not gonna be what you expect it to be all the time. I think a lot of times we want it to follow the logical pattern, and in wanting it to follow the logical pattern, when it doesn't, we stop and we turn around and we go, oh man, I guess God's closing that door because it doesn't make sense anymore. Like why on earth would your standard for whether or not it's God's plan be your logic? Like, why would you allow the fact that it doesn't make sense to you anymore to be the thing that decides whether or not the door's open or the door's closed? Like, a lot of times I feel like that's the excuse, is like we walk through life, we feel like God's placed this dream in our hearts, we're pursuing it, we're trying to figure it out, we're trying to make it happen, we're committed to it, let's go. And then what happens is we get to a place and nothing about it makes sense anymore, I don't really get it, and we say, well, the door's closed, all the doors closed, and since all the doors closed, it must not be God's plan. And I think that there are some times when God is like, hey, break through the wall and make a new door. Like, God is like, hey, there's a window over there. Like, there's other ways for this to get done. I don't work the way that you want me to work. I work the way I work, which is the third point, which is God will test you along the way. All right. So I think a lot of times we want it to follow our pattern. We want it to make sense to us. And when it doesn't make sense to us, we give up, which means we just failed the first test because we're not trusting him through it when it doesn't make sense anymore. He's gonna test you along the way. There's a lot. Okay. I hate it when people say God's must be testing me right now. So like, hear me in that. Like, he's gonna test you along the way. I hate it when people go, he must be testing me right now. Because my initial reaction is always like, ooh. Because usually when people say that, it makes God sound mean. They're like, life is really hard right now. He's just testing me so much. And it's like, I don't think God puts you through crazy hard things just to, but then on the flip side, like, I think he puts you through crazy hard things just to show you. You see what I'm saying? Like, this point is, God tests Joseph by allowing him to be sold into slavery and by allowing him to be accused of assault. Am I saying that God made Joseph be sold into slavery? I don't know. I like to think no, but God's sovereign and God has a plan. And if God did do that, we can ask him to explain it when we get to heaven one day. I think more likely than not, he saw this coming and he used it to strengthen Joseph, right? He used it to show Joseph. He gets accused, he raises up, then he gets accused of this assault. Now he's back in the dungeon. Do I think God made Potiphar's wife accuse him of that? No. Could he? Maybe. Yeah. He's God. He can do anything. But no. But I think he used that situation. So, anyway, He tests Joseph along the way. The thing that you got to unpack here is God uses these moments in ways that grows Joseph towards the ultimate plan. It's not for nothing. It's not for no reason. I think that's ultimately why I get frustrated when people say that, oh, God must be testing me right now. It's not that I don't think God tests people. It's that I think oftentimes we disconnect the test from the overall goal. And so it's just like God is just like some really mean math teacher who just throws pop quizzes at you all the time. I say math because I was terrible at math. And so if you gave me a lot of pop quizzes in math, you would be mean by definition. Just throwing pop quizzes at you all the time, like out of nowhere, like, hey, pop quiz, but there's no reason for it. Like we divorce the test from the overall goal, and that's not how it works. You get tested, and God's testing you because he's preparing you. And that's the thing that's happening here with Joseph is he ends up being sold into slavery. God uses that because he ends up learning how to run a whole estate. And you gotta understand, like, this is very helpful in helping him figure out how to deal with the supply problems during a famine and feast. Why? Well, he's got to run a whole estate, which means he's learning how to deal with the harvest every year. And you might think like, well, yeah, but look, they don't have a grocery store. Everything that house needs to eat either has to be traded for or they have to grow themselves, and they have to figure out how to store it. They have to figure out how to keep it. And so he learns how to manage this estate. Then he ends up in jail, and he becomes the leader amongst all the prisoners. This is just my commentary on it, but listen, the main thing I think that Joseph learned when he was in prison was how to lead people that didn't want anything to do with him and didn't want to be there. Which, in terms of leadership, is one of the hardest things to do. How do you lead somebody that doesn't like you and doesn't care what you have to say? Joseph has to figure that out, and it's gonna matter because all of a sudden, he's a Hebrew slave who's in charge of like the whole kingdom, right? God's preparing him for what's coming by using the tests along the way. And the last thing is something we talk about all the time. Your dreams happen in his timing. Basically, the dreams he placed on your heart will begin to come true when you're ready. And that's the most annoying thing in the world. You ever get told, not get told, you probably don't get told this anymore because most of you are adults. My kids, Nora asked so many questions. One time, she was asking me a bunch of questions. I'm like, baby, can you listen to what I'm saying? Because I'm answering your questions before you're asking them, and you're just asking them a different way. Like, can you listen? And she says, Daddy, I'm just a why asker. Like, all right, I see. She asked so many questions, and there's sometimes I just have to look at her, and I'm like, baby, I'll explain that one to you when you're older. I can't, like, you're not gonna understand right now. And like, as much as we don't like it, there's an element to our spiritual lives and to the purposes and plans that God's placed on our hearts that's like, you'll be ready when you're ready, and he's not gonna give it to you before you're ready. And that ultimately is what this time is all about, right here. In this story arc of these biblical heroes, and it's true of our lives too, the majority of their time, and I think the majority of our time, is spent in this period of obscurity where God is preparing you for what he has for you. And that's so frustrating and hard, but it's the most necessary thing. We just talked about how it worked for Joseph, and this obscurity period for Joseph, God was preparing him to do what he ultimately did. I mean, the same is true. The same is true of all of the other biblical heroes that we went through. God used those times to prepare to prepare them for the plans that he had for them. And that's true of you. Like that you may feel like I'm just wandering right now. I feel like God told me that, I feel like God called me to this, or God told me that this would be the thing that I could focus on one day, or this is, whatever. I feel like God gave me this, but like it's not working right now. It's not good right now. It's not fun right now. It's kind of hard right now. Like maybe I am in that obscurity place, but if it's God's plan, why does it suck so bad? Right? Why is this so terrible? And I feel like there are a lot of times where we, where we're just incapable of being patient and waiting on God. So we live a half hour from here, right? We live a half hour from here. We built a house like right before we started working here, so like weren't able to move into the community, so we live a half hour. We also, though, we live 20 minutes from my parents. Like basically everywhere I drive, the drive's gonna be 20 minutes, at least, maybe a half hour. We end up in the car a lot. We also end up going on trips with the kids and everything else are in the car, right? And so Nora's the main one who does this because she's old enough to kind of understand time. So she'll sit in the back and we'll be on a ride somewhere. This happened on vacation. So we're driving down to North Carolina and she's all the way in the back because she's got the big girl booster seat now and she can clip herself in and everything else. So she sits in the back, clips herself in, and she's back there. And there's a couple problems with this that personally, this has nothing to do with sermon, this part, but when she's sitting in the back and she's talking to me, most frustrating thing in the world, because I'm deaf on my right side. So she'll be talking to me. She's on my right side in the van, and she's like 8 feet behind me, and she's talking like I'm right next to her, and I can't hear a word she's saying, because my good ear is towards the window, which is loud because of the wind and everything, right? So I'm just like, I don't know. So she'll be sitting in the back, and, what? Gotta keep my eye on the road, right? How much longer? 6 hours, honey, 6 hours. Hours? That's so many. That's gonna take ages. No, baby, it's gonna take hours. But Daddy, I gotta go pee. We just got in the car. Take her into the bathroom, I don't have to pee anymore. All right, cool. Can we just stay at the gas station? I don't want to get back in the car. I feel like a lot of times that's the level of patience we have with God along the way. Like that's the level of patience how much longer? You're not ready yet. But that's gonna take ages for me to be ready? You didn't even put my shoes on in 5 minutes. When's it gonna get better? You're not ready yet. Can we just stay here? This is easier, King David went through that long period of obscurity. He was anointed to be the next king of Israel. And the current king was still alive and very much on the throne. And so he had this long period of waiting. And Saul didn't like David very much because you could imagine that if somebody was told that they were going to get your job, that would make you angry, right? And so it was a long period of waiting and running from King Saul. And the scholars believe that one of the time periods this could have been written was in a period when he was being chased by King Saul. So this is Psalm 130, verse 5. I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits, and in his word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord. When it comes to the plans and the dreams that God has placed on your heart, and then the process of getting there and seeing those come through, more often than not, a large portion of your time is going to be spent waiting on the Lord. Not the kind of waiting where you're sitting doing nothing. The kind of waiting where you're doing the things you know you're supposed to do till he tells you to do the things he told you to do. Does that make sense? You need to be active doing the things you know you're supposed to do until he tells you to do the thing he told you to do. That's what waiting on the Lord looks like. And that's what we're going to spend a lot of our time doing until the day comes that he looks at us and he says, you're ready. Let's go. Anyway, let me pray with you. God, give us patience for the waiting. Give us wisdom to learn in the times of waiting. Give us the discipline to continue doing the things we know we're supposed to do until you tell us what to do. And God, just make us a people that's faithful to you, that waits on you and is faithful in the whole process, so that one day we'll be a people that's defined by living in your purposes, by living out your dreams, by doing the things that you've placed on our hearts that we should do. Lord, let us be a people that follow you and that see your dreams come true in our lives. And not because we're awesome, but just because we were just smart enough to trust that your dreams and your plans are better than ours. Lord, we love you and we thank you. Amen.